for the day. I'd like to thank everyone for being here, and especially special thanks to David, Sabina for setting this up, and the rest of MUC. I believe this is the fourth SR&ED Stakeholder, third or fourth, whereas I know he's been doing his annual web meetings, almost 12 years now. So on that note, we'd like to respect everybody's time, so we will get started right away. We're going to start initially with the SR&D by Medical Corps. And I believe, Julie, you are going to start, which is good because I don't think Brian has checked in yet.
It's actually, Earl, I'm going to be starting.
Oh, sorry, David.
Yep. So I'm going to get started. Can you get rid of, forget about the camera. Okay, thanks. Hey, everybody. Okay, here we go. So off to a late start. Please let me know if my volume's off or anything. So just real quick, a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. We've got the master files that everyone can go and download off the SRED Stakeholder website, and you'll see that there's a link to it at the same place where you registered for it. So as Earl said, we're going to talk for about close to an hour about medical issues, maybe a little less, and we're going to try to speed things up through sections 1 and 2 if possible. In order to spend a little more time on section 3. I don't know that we'll be able to cover all the content that we've got in section 3, but we'll try to get through it, and we'll try to go very quickly. Okay, if anyone's got questions as we're going through, please feel free to use the chat menu in Adobe, or if you're on Twitch, to use the chat there, and we'll try to answer questions. Okay, talking about medical issues. So, as Earl said, we've been running these seminars or practitioners groups for, geez, I'd say it's pretty close to over 20 years now. Probably started in the early 90s, and it's been a great opportunity to deal with CRA and just get an idea of where there's agreement and areas where there's contention. So the medical issues have really focused on 2 or 3 key issues, and we're going to talk about those today. And there's some minor issues as well that we can deal with that are related really to the top 3 issues. And to take a little look back, if you want to go to our website, we can see that these issues have been addressed in numerous presentations going back through 2016 up to today by myself, Julie Bond, the groups at RDP, Brian Cookson, and Andrew McPhail, as well as the Maurice Goulet. So different perspectives on the same issues. And what I'm going to do today is a bit of a recap. And that's kind of why Julie and I were developing this together. And we decided that for flow, it was probably better that one person go through so we don't step on the same issues. All right. So in late 2019, there was a paper released, a direction paper, on the SR&ED claims for medical practitioner corporations. And this is an area where there's a fair amount of uncertainty right now, and has been for probably about 4 or 5 years. And we'll talk about today about the current issues, a brief history of it, but more importantly, where the issues are today and where we can expect to go forward with that. So what we look at here is 2 scenarios. And the first scenario is the physician is an independent contractor, so a proprietor, as opposed to doing work in his or her medical corporation. And ultimately, the way that the Canada Revenue Agency is looking at this is interesting, that work is either done by the researcher directly, I would call it, or it's done on behalf of another party. And these terms become important as we're starting to go through the legislation a little bit later on. And anyways, to make a long story short, what the position is for an individual is that they could be doing the research themselves, in which case they would claim it on their T1 return. They could be doing research for another party, in which case we may have a contract payment or government assistance, and we're going to talk about that. And they may have a case where it's mixed, in which case we'll talk about the implications there as well. but there would be a potential claim for the work done and paid for by the party themselves. Okay? So the individual physicians can basically claim qualified expenditures, whether they're doing it for themselves or for another party. And this is the same for a medical practitioner corporation, except the fundamental difference here is that the medical practitioner corporation could be doing the work themselves or another party, or again, both, but the one stipulation or the addition here is that the medical corporation could be doing supporting work for a job done by the physician. So the physician's in scenario 1, whereas the physician's employees are in the medical corporation adding supporting work in there. So the question then again becomes, who claims it? And ultimately what happens is the CRA is now focused on the contract. Who does it say is in the contract performing the work? Does it engage the medical professional corporation, or does it in fact engage the individual? And if it engages the individual, then they might make the argument that the medical professional corporation has no right to claim its expenses, and it should be claimed by the individual physician. This becomes problematic because, again, the individual physicians are proprietors, which means they can't claim themselves, which means they have no salary, again, and this will ultimately be very negative on the claim. Secondly, you generally always want to claim in a corporation as opposed to a proprietorship because the credits vary differently. Okay. So this brings us into a series of definitions that are going to be relevant then when doing this work. And the first is if we're doing work on behalf of another party. Okay, so what does that mean if we're doing work on behalf of another party? And one of the key terms that's relevant here is a term called contract payment. Okay? And a contract payment is in subsection 127.9 of the Act, and it's basically a payment that you've received from another taxpayer for performing R&D. And the stipulation here is that if it's another Canadian taxpayer, that Canadian taxpayer actually has to file a claim under Section 37, which means they have to file a claim for SR&ED. So if another Canadian taxpayer pays me, a private company, and does not claim the SR&ED on that, had they been able to or not, I may be able to claim that as the performer. Again, the only issue there is that there's no double dip. The second category is if the work is done by any level of Canadian government or non-for-profit type personnel. So again, if you're getting funds from any level of Canadian government in order to do the research, then that would be seen as assistance and it would reduce the claim. So to summarize, a contract payment exists only if it's from government or another taxable supplier, okay? And that taxable supplier intends to claim the credits. So the implications are that Canadian source contract payments for SR&ED are generally going to reduce your claim along with government assistance, but foreign source payments will not. Now, in the CRA's paper, they also talked about certain factors to determine who did the work here. So are there legal agreements? Are there verbal or written agreements? Who has the obligation in these legal agreements to do the research? Now, one of the really interesting things, and this is one of the things from talking to practitioners that I found, is often a contract may say it's the individual who's contracted the doctor. However, all of the work and all of the fees and funds are paid to the medical corporation. So in practice, there's a bit of a discontinuity, and also what can happen is a contract may say that it's by the practitioner, and it can be done directly or through a medical professional corporation. So again, there's legal issues that can affect things back and forth. Okay. So when you're involved in these reviews or a medical review, we find that the CRA often requests a large amount of information. And we'll talk about some of that in a little bit. But particularly in preparing a claim, you want to think about what kinds of things should I look at beforehand to make sure that all the information flows in the right direction. So the things that they'll look at are, what are your major business activities? Are you providing services, or are you providing research, or a combination of the two? What do your agreements say with healthcare entities? How are you compensated? Is it salary? Is it wages? There's all kinds of different scenarios. So people may work for research hospitals, where the hospitals collect all the funds and then keep a percentage of them for administrative duties, or you may have completely independent practices, and you may have all kinds of relationships in between that. So again, you want to be clear on how that works, and there is no solid rhyme or reason. I've seen all kinds of setups, many different ways, and it varies by hospital or research institution and by province widely. Okay, but basically you want to figure out at the end of the day how much salary was the physician paid, whether it was through a medical corporation that's eligible to claim, and how is that tracked? How do we differentiate between the work that's medical and work that's SR&ED, rather, research, and work that's non-SR&ED? So I'd say one of the fundamental problems centers around the interpretation of the words directly undertaken. And a sample, from a ruling or a response that CRA will have when they deny a taxpayer is that the wages of the employee were not directly undertaken on behalf of the taxpayer. And this is an interesting position, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail, because this is a legal position here. We're talking about the words directly undertaken in the Act itself, and then we have to look at a definition. What does directly undertaken mean? Okay, and from discussions with the CRA, I believe that the CRA interprets the words directly undertaken to mean that you're contracted directly and that the contract is not, in fact, to another party in the middle, and therefore you're taking it, working on it perhaps indirectly. They've never said this, but I'm saying the position that they're taking, it appears that that's the way that they're thinking. Okay, so last year, before our presentation in 2019, we had feedback from the Director General. We've talked about this in our last presentation, so I won't speak much on it, but I've repeated it because the directives are still relevant. And the CRA is saying that they recognize that there can be cooperation and collaboration, and that's very common in research. However, it's up to each party to determine its own eligible expenses, and that's really what we're talking about now. So all parties agree that it's possible for the parties to claim, but it's very important that the parties keep proper records and can really delineate not only how much the expenses were, but who has the right to claim those. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the legislation to go back, because we're talking about the term directly undertaken. Okay? So I'm going to go back first and talk about the definition of SR&ED in 248 sub 1 of the Income Tax Act. And it specifically includes certain activities, including data collection, testing, and mathematical analysis that are commensurate with the needs of the projects. So very often what happens is you might see a researcher who perhaps has a project that they do as a staff member at a university or a professor there, but those contracts may be 2 or 3 days a week, and they may run their own private practice 2 or 3 days a week. So that's a common scenario. And in these cases, they may actually, in my opinion, be doing the research work at the university, which is their T1 work, and they get paid for as an individual. And then in their practice, they may actually be doing additional projects which follow up or expand on their university work in the nature of data collection, testing, and related analysis. So it's not uncommon to see not only one or another scenario as the new directive paper is put out, but actually both scenarios, that the individual is performing research both as an individual and through their medical professional corporation. Okay, so the Act itself, 37 sub 1, says that there may be deducted SR&ED expenses, which then leads to the credits for SR&ED carried on and directly undertaken by the taxpayer. So those are the words in the Income Tax Act themselves. And then for a definition of what does directly undertaken mean, we actually have to look at the definition in the Act. Now, the term contract payment, as we saw earlier, has a specific definition in the Act. I can go to 127 sub 9, and it says a contract payment has this specific definition. And in this case, a contract payment may not be what an average person may assume. If I ask an average person off the street, what's a contract payment, they may not say it's a payment for SR&ED where the other SR&ED claimant doesn't claim it, okay, or not. But in this case, the term directly engaged is not defined in the Act. There is no specific definition that I'm aware of the term directly engaged. Directly undertaken. So when there's no immediate definition, what the courts say is we go for a common law definition. What would a reasonable person interpreting those words feel directly undertaken means? I would propose that if I asked the average person, if you were directly undertaking something or were you directly engaged in something, would that not be synonymous? And I think most people would agree that that is. And therefore, I say that directly engaged is a little bit of a directive for us to look at. When I put these slides up, I know one of the comments of the CRA is that they felt I was confusing the terms directly engaged and directly undertaken. And I clarify that I'm not actually confusing them. I'm proposing that they're synonymous and that their definition of directly undertaken may be a little too constrictive to mean that you have to be the only person on the contract and there can be no one in between. Okay. So as I said, the term directly undertaken is not defined in the Income Tax Act. I'm proposing that the term directly engaged is interesting and similar, and then we can get an example of what that means. And ultimately, if the work is directly undertaken, then the party that can do it can claim. And my position here in most of the scenarios that I've seen is particularly where two parties, an individual and a medical professional corporation, could claim, that both parties may in fact be able to claim. Okay. One of the issues that pops up in claims, or it used to, it's not as much prevalent anymore, is the issue of who owns intellectual property. And this is interesting for a number of reasons, and I believe that it actually impacts not only medical claims but claims in general. And one of the things that I want to say here is that eligibility to claim SR&ED credits does not require full ownership of intellectual property. It requires entitlement to exploit the results. And this is an issue that was originally outlined in the Interpretation Bulletin 151, which the Canada Revenue Agency replaced with a whole series of papers in 2012. But one of the things that the paper says is that you don't need to own the rights, you just have to have some preferential right to use it. It could be a royalty, it could be a preferential right to use the product in a place, it could be the right to use a patent. Again, it doesn't require absolute ownership of a technology, it requires an entitlement to exploit that technology, which is a fundamentally different concept. After the rewrite of the policy papers back in 2012, the CRA released in 2014 a third-party payment policy paper, and they've basically moved their entitlement to exploit results into that section dealing with third-party policy papers. I remember at the time that this happened having an issue. Oops, did I just blank? Sorry. I remember at the time this happened having an issue with the CRA on the entitlement to exploit issue and feeling that we'd won that, but the fact that they'd moved it to this other paper meant that it was going to get swept under the table or misinterpreted as it may be currently. And back in 2012 to 2015 period, we were assured by the previous Director General that this wouldn't be the case and that nothing had changed. But what I'd say here is that there seems to be a clear shift in policy on the entitlement to exploit issue, and it's something that should be addressed and probably clarified in a future paper. Okay. The second major issue dealing with medical claims is what they call alternative funding, or basically government assistance. Now, the typical response that we would get on a denial before was that the researcher, whether through their professional corporation or as an individual, received part of his or her payments, whether it's OHIP payments in Ontario or whatever, they received an additional amount called alternative funding. And this was to represent whether if people were specialists or people were working in outlying areas, and we'll talk about what it really means. But it has a number of factors. It could be upwards of 50 factors, I would say, and research is one of them. So basically, doctors who are specialists or engage in certain activities get a premium of payment, and they can use this premium here. They can have this payment deemed to be government assistance. And the effect of having that is that the government assistance will then reduce any amount that they can claim for the SR&ED. Now, so previously, one of the things that they were doing is they were taking anything that they called academic funds or AFP payments for academic funds, and they're also looking at other things like something called clinical repair funds and other things of that nature. Since then, we've argued successfully, I'd say, that the academic funds may be research, but the clinical repair funds probably are not. And the CRAs subsequently recently agreed that that's a reasonable breakdown. The one position that they were taking before, and this was based on their own policy, was that the amount of government assistance had to be allocated reasonably. And the position that they had is if there wasn't a reasonable breakdown, then 100% of any funding would be included. So the effect here was that in many cases a doctor would agree that maybe 5 or 8 or 10% of the AFP funding might be research related, but it probably wasn't 100%, and that was an unreasonable position. However, it was very hard to support that position, and we'll talk a little bit about why those problems happened. Okay, so basically the new position is the CRA is willing to look at reasonable basis and say, well, what do you think is reasonable for these allocations? And the funny things that we'll talk about are the fact that there probably should be a trail to provide the CRA with the information that they're looking for. But basically, the key stipulation is that there's a lot of vagaries and there's a lot of problems that can come in that interpretation. Okay? Now, what the Act says is the reduction for qualified expenditures are against any of the AFP payments or any of the payments that reasonably can be considered in respect of the scientific research. Okay? A quick example of an AFP practice model in Ontario would say that the AFP models cover things like community services, individuals in single departments, a whole list of specialties, and research, along with a variety of things. So the real question is saying, out of all the AFP payments and all of the possible reasons that they could be dealt with, what percentage of that was related to research? And the CRA, I believe, has a good position here that they are required to get a reasonable allocation of this. And the problem is that even though many of the actual contracts with the doctors and these research organizations say that these projects and things are supposed to be approved by every member every year, in the contract, legally, it almost never happens. So there's an issue that legally we should have the information, but in reality, it doesn't exist. And perhaps the CRA is right in saying, well, that's not their fault that the hospitals or the research organizations themselves are not willing to provide the breakdowns to the constituents or to the researchers. And I can say from personal experience that it can be a very touchy issue, that some of the larger research hospitals, and it's the more senior researchers that'll confide in me and tell me, because they don't really have as much to fear, they're on their way out, that it's really not in anyone's interest to rock the boat, as they say, by asking too many questions about how money's spent or allocated. And that can tend to get management upset at you and affect your career, where they want you to focus on the research and not the business side of things. Okay, so there's a lot of politics involved in playing here, but I think that fundamentally there's weaknesses on all sides, and that the CRAs making the best of a situation where they need reasonable allocations that should be made, but basically the organizations responsible are not providing that information. Okay, so there's shortcomings all the way around. Okay. One of the interesting things is that a lot of these initiatives that we're talking about the AFP and the directly engaged, started as local initiatives rather than a federal initiative that went through a stakeholder analysis or things, and were vetted and discussed by people like us. However, I'd say that in the last year or two, and we'll talk about some statistics to back this up, things have started to come back on track. The medical paper is a great step in that right direction to understand what are the problems with claims and the interpretations of it. Can we communicate this, and then can we give the claimants the opportunities to correct any problems that might have prevented them, if possible, in order that they can claim it. And we'll talk about some of the planning that we can do on that as we go. Okay, so some of my recommendations are: one, improve reporting by hospitals and research organizations themselves in order to provide those breakdowns or a reasonable allocation of the assistance. That would be fantastic. Okay. One of the issues that we brought up was the number of objections, and I think that from speaking to CRA and in the objections office there, the number of objections for medical has stopped growing and has become stable. So that's not a huge problem that we have right now. And also, one of our big issues before was the consistency or what we perceived as inconsistency of the guidelines across Canada. And again, this new paper and the new directives, I think, will help hopefully get some level of national consistency here. Okay. Now, one of the issues that's popped up out of, I would say, the first two issues is evidence of actual SR&ED where an individual or a researcher is hired often by a foreign group to help them with a study. Okay? And the question then becomes, is the researcher under contract doing experimental development, SR&ED, or are they really just fulfilling the contract and doing more of a clerical task where they'll test patients, collect data, and provide the data to the sponsor that's paying them, but not really be involved in the analysis of the data, the development of the protocols, or so forth. They're really performing a data collection procedure without any related research. And this is going to be a question of judgment every time. But the question is, what would be reasonable evidence? And this is where it gets kind of tricky, because often the types of research that go on are regular meetings that they have, or webcasts, or things that may or may not have transcripts. They're often emails or notes on listing changes to protocols. But the protocols may be in a specialist area. So often, scenarios I've seen is that there may be a worldwide study going on in different countries, and one or two particular specialists in Canada may be engaged. And those specialists may in turn have their own specialties where they're trying to take the protocols and maybe adjust them in some way based on their specialty. So I've seen situations where this information was provided and the CRA's response was that there were no documents available to substantiate the contribution to the hypothesis, formulation, or design of the protocol. So, in these cases, I don't know whether it's problems with particular reviewers and they're ignoring information, or more an issue of what information is relevant here, and understanding that it is somewhat hard to catch because they may be very little ideas or concepts that may have effects at the end. So one of the questions is, well, how much of a degree? Do I have to change all the protocols? Can I make a small degree of change in the protocol? How much is relevant enough in order to create the eligibility for SR&ED? And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So just closing off on the new document, they have a list of some of the documents that they're going to request. And most of those are relatively easy to, most of those are relatively easy to understand. Evidence of scientific uncertainties, departures from standard practice, the study protocols and amendments are the ones that you would typically think of them asking for. One of the some of the other things that they're looking for are, the ethics board documentation, the clinical study agreements, the actual patient consent forms, variations of those, right? Again, so your question might be, why are they looking at all of these other documents? What's the purpose of that? And there are purposes of that. But understanding this when you're doing a claim and what information is in those documents and how it may affect the claim is, I'd say, very important too, and not well understood in the community. So I think that there could be some future direction on why are we asking for this and what should you do in order to make sure that you're conforming to the rules to the best of your ability within all of these frameworks. Okay. All right, now some of the recommendations, and these slides are done by myself and part of our group as well. What we recommend is look at your contracts. If you have a problem where arguably the contract between your corporation was with you as an individual, with the payer was with you as an individual instead of your medical professional corporation, maybe see if you can redo the contract. The other thing is on your timekeeping. Keep track of your actual time versus the time that you actually spend. So if you work evenings, weekends, etc., and so forth on the research, and you can back that up, that's all legitimate time, and it should be included. Okay. One of the other things we'll talk about is the pre-claim project review. It's not done very often, but as we'll see from the statistics, but I think it's an opportunity here to get an initial feeling on whether there's going to be problems and perhaps some directives as to all of the issues that we talked about. What's the importance of these papers? Am I following a procedure or a path that's optimizing these, or perhaps there's methods that I could do this better? Okay, and the CRA seems really willing to help people in this pre-claim process review stage. I think that maybe when it first came out, it was used more to dissuade people, or claimants, but lately it's having more of a positive impact. Okay. So as we said, what we want to do is review the contracts, make sure that the contracts are structured properly. If they're not, perhaps see if we can redo the contract. Make sure that we deduct any grants or contract payments or government assistance. And one of our other practitioners recommend maybe even looking at the personal tax return. It's a good idea to understand for a claimant in a medical professional corporation, again, where they have income. Do they have the dual income? So if I'm engaged just by the medical professional corporation, but they are doing other work and someone else is doing their T1, it's still good to know what the overall setup is and that we explain that in the allocation of the costs. Okay, one of the points here is the CRA has something called a First-Time Claimant Advisory Service, or FTCAS. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the statistics a little later on, but this was being introduced to most medical professional corporations when they did their first claim. And what we found several years ago, both myself and several other practitioners that I've talked to, is that the meetings were used to perhaps approve 1 year of a client's claim, but then to dissuade them from claiming for various reasons that we talked about, whether they're directly engaged or other types of issues. And clients in this case, as medical practitioners, tend to really want to follow the tax laws. They don't want any problems with the Canada Revenue Agency. And if the Canada Revenue Agency, tells them clearly and unequivocally that they shouldn't do it, they'll probably not do it. So what we found as practitioners is, and I've asked around, is that this problem is not as problematic in the last year or two. However, there may be issues on it in that practitioners, I know many practitioners in the past have been dissuaded from claiming, and maybe wrongly so. So they should think about perhaps coming back and revisiting whether they are eligible and ask for a process review or talk to a consultant on that. Okay. All right. Now I'll basically turn that back to Earl if there's any questions on that. Field it before we move on to the section on statistics and new programs. And in the new section here, actually, let me just double check something. The first speaker in the new section will actually be Susan Grant. We had to do a little shuffle in our presentation order here, so we moved that one up, just that she had another conflicting presentation today. So she'll be the next speaker, and I'll pass it back to you, Earl, then, if you want to field any questions before we move on to the next section.
Yeah, thank you. There is one person's raised their hand. For question purposes, it's probably best to type in the chat, but we'll make a quick exception here. Go ahead, your question. G. Shaw, no. Out there. Julie, did you want to make a comment?
I can't find the chat section, so I wasn't able to put my questions in. Could you help me direct to where I enter a chat or a comment?
Just go ahead. We can hear you, Julie. We can hear you.
I know you can hear me now, but
we're seeing also, just to add to the the discouragement from CRA when they visit you on the first-time claimant advisory, even after a form, a rejection of the claim, they're sort of giving appendixes, or writing in the appendix that you don't have a loss, or you've incurred. And so they discourage you from even going down the notice, filing a notice of objection, because you'd have to write a letter asking the agency to issue a form T67AM for a loss determination.
Oh, okay.
I was wondering if, have you seen that as a practice? Yeah, go ahead.
That's actually an interest. That's specific to each company. So you're right. So you ask, basically you need to have a notice of objection, or sorry, a notice of assessment to file a claim. If it's a loss situation, it may be argued that that's not assessment, so you ask for something called a notice of determination. Ultimately, that's really just a formality. You request that, and it's going to add a little time, so it could affect your deadlines and things like that. But it shouldn't be something that prevents the objection. To make a long story short.
Thank you.
Okay. So do you want me to make some comments there, Dave? Since
Please, Julie,
I think
go
you guys
ahead.
can hear me, right? Okay.
Yes.
So going back to the beginning of your presentation with regards to the contract payments. The way it was explained to me is that ITC, because this came up in one of my cases many years ago, ITC apparently is not transferable. So it's not like two Canadian companies can decide which one of them is going to get it, right? It has to, it's an entitlement based on the facts. And that's why if you have a foreign entity, that's the contract, there is no entitlement on the other side, and it can revert to the Canadian. But where you made a comment about, which one of the Canadian companies is going to take it, and if one doesn't take it, then the other can. My understanding from an audit years ago is that that's not the case, and that even if one company that's a Canadian company that's entitled to it chooses not to claim it, they cannot transfer it, right? So that's maybe something you might want to look into at the legal level of the transferability of ITC and the entitlement between two Canadian taxpayers. I also wanted to mention with regards to the contracts with the MPC, and it's something I was chatting with you about last night. So a lot of times the contract with the HCE is they put the name of the doctor. And then CRA's position is, well, you've contracted with the doctor. But what's fascinating about it is they don't actually contract with the doctor. They pay all the funds to the MPC. But technically, it looks like they've contracted with the doctor because the doctor's name is on there, and I think it's more of a technicality or an inconsistency at the HCE level because they don't realize the significance of it. But the question of law I have is, well, did they really contract with the person if they make all the payments to the MPC, right? So then I would revert to a matter of logic is that, well, they probably did contract with the MPC since they, in fact, just pay the MPC on a regular basis, and they don't actually pay the person either as a subcontractor, privately, or through a T4. So that's something I think that should be clarified and raised with CRA, is that the contract payment is perhaps a little bit more relevant than the administrative issue of a hospital who doesn't recognize the difference on the contract. And with regards to the directly undertaken, I have some concerns with directly undertaken where CRA takes a position that the work was not undertaken on behalf of the MPC, but was undertaken on behalf of another party. And at that point, I also go back to the payments. So I find this peculiar, or maybe a little bit intriguing, where we have the doctor who does not actually work for any other entity or receive a T4 from any other entity, and only works for his or her MPC, and therefore the logic would be, well, they must have undertaken their work on behalf of the MPC because it is their only source of income. And as you mentioned, and I've also put it out there before, look at the personal tax return. So if there is no personal income from any other source, is there any merit to the argument that the work was done on behalf of another party? Well, in that case, we have to ask whether they volunteered, right? So this comes into other legal questions, and I think the personal tax return has been very helpful. And for us, it's been helpful in arguments when we've been in the rebuttal stage. So those are some of the things I wanted to comment. And with regards to protocol development, I've been in a situation before where I've asked a high-ranking CRA auditor whether the candidate client needs to have proved that they developed a protocol themselves. And the answer was no, that the uncertainty is the uncertainty whether they developed a protocol themselves or not, whether it was handed to them, which is often the case in a clinical trial. That reviewer did not believe that it was relevant. But the problem is that it's not really particularly written down anywhere in policy about all these documents the CRA is asking for, and whether protocol development is in fact a criteria or not. So I personally would like to see more discussions with CRA about the clinical trials, in international clinical trials, and whether the protocol development itself is actually a criteria or not. Those are some of the comments that I had based upon your very worthwhile introduction to the discussion, and we of course do a lot of cases like you do in this sector. So I think I just wanted to add a little bit of feedback there, if that's helpful.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank
Okay,
you.
great.
Dave, should we move on to the next presentation,
Yeah,
please?
no, I imagine Russ, that would be Russ. So we'll, Russ, will you be presenting, or is Susan presenting through your feed?
I'm going to comment at the end of this idea.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
David, you're going to,
Yes.
and I will comment towards the end.
Having trouble hearing you, Russ. Bad echo.
Okay, Russ. You can control and Susan, I can basically I'll put it on the first screen for you, and you can start explaining about your new petition.
Russ, you there?
I think Russ is just actually handing it over to Susan, he said, so it maybe it'll take a second or something. Give him a minute.
Are you able to hear me?
Hi, Russ.
Hi, Russ. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, we've gotten to some discussions with the government. Back and all the innovative techniques, all the listing process. There's a lot of state. You have created a survey to try to pick up more on this.
Are you there, Russ?
Yes.
Susan? Yeah, do you want to talk about the Rnr Emergency Fund? Does Susan want to talk about that briefly, or should we just skip about that? Or do you want me to do it?
Let's skip it until she shows up, okay?
Okay. So sorry. Yeah. So Susan, I'll just recap real quickly here, and then if Susan can chime in later as we go forward. So real quickly, CADA has developed or started a petition, and the links are on the website in these funds. Susan will talk a little better, but ultimately what it's looking at is called the Rnr Emergency Fund, and it's looking at the great work that Canada has done, I think, in the COVID on the SR&ED claims now that they've cleared a lot of the backlog. But the question is, what's going to happen for the next year now with COVID and whatnot? And maybe we can get some kind of process for desk review or more, basically keep things rolling on the SR&ED and not get a huge backlog. So I'll let Susan talk about that more. She can log in on that, and then at this point we'll move on to the next section, which is myself. Okay, so leading right on into the statistics. Then, what we do each year is we look at a bunch of statistics from Canada Revenue Agency on the SR&ED. They're published in something called the CRA Red Book. And one of the things that we looked this year is that the claims seem relatively stable, that there's around 20,000 claims a year, and the ITCs granted this year versus last year were slightly less, 4% less, but not much, and we'll talk about that a little later, that there was actually an increase in the claims for refundable and a decrease in non-refundables, but that overall the total number of claims are stabilized, and I'd say that's a good thing. So I often, or generally, I try to send my slides to the CRA in Ottawa before I present them to see if they have any feedback or comments. And their comment on this slide was that even though it looks on the other slide as if the 2020 claims went down, there was actually, the intake did not include the last 2 weeks of March because of the COVID issues, and that in actuality, when those are included, the current year was an increase over last year. Okay. The other comment that they have that I'm going to talk about, it's kind of interesting, is they don't talk about ITCs by hours. And I'll explain what that means as we look at a few of our other slides here. Okay? So just to take a perspective of, let's look back a decade at the SR&ED ITCs and what's happened. And looking at it fundamentally, there was a peak around 2007, and a decline in the total ITCs to 2010, and then a ramp up again to 2014. We pretty much hit a peak in 2014 of 25,000 claims and around almost $3.4 billion a year federally being allocated. So there was a steady growth up from 2010 to 2014, and then from 2014 to 2018, we saw some pretty drastic changes, a 27% drop. And you know, we've been talking about that, and And a lot of the issues that fell out of that over the past few years in our practitioners' meetings. But the good news is that this trend seems to have settled, and that those sharp declines, now whether they were a correction of bad claims or whether they were done judiciously or not can be another topic. But one of the things that we'll look at is how are the claims being adjusted? And in the details to the Red Book report, they have a series of tables about the total number of claims processed by region. And one of the things that we can see is that an average of 15.4, roughly 15% claims across Canada are set for review, on-site review generally, as opposed to being approved as filed. The interesting thing there is that percentage goes as high as 20% in the prairies, or as low as 12.5% in Ontario Centre. So there is some variation amongst that. What's even more interesting is that the adjustment rates go as high as 40%. So in Atlantic Canada, if they do a coordinated review, the adjustment's 40% of the total credits, versus in Pacific Canada, it's as low as 13%. Okay, and on average in Canada, it's a 23%. So if you're going to have a coordinated review, on average, you can expect almost a quarter of your claim to be removed or denied on average. But there's huge variations, I would say, provincially. This is getting over to a calculation here that I did, where I said, well, we also have the total hours that the reviewer spent in each province. And if I go back to the other slide on the total ITCs that were granted or allowed versus the total hours spent by reviewers, I've come up with a calculation called ITCs per hour. And CRA mentioned that they don't look at that metric or calculation, and that's fine. But nonetheless, I do find it interesting, and I'd say I have questions on why the national average would be, roughly 7,500, but Pacific Canada seems to get more bang for the buck, the reviewers there, and in Atlantic Canada, it's a third. So perhaps this is just coincidence, or if you believe in numbers like I do, I'd say there's probably some underlying tale to explain this, and that perhaps the policies are being applied differently across Canada, or maybe just researchers in Atlantic Canada aren't as strong as in Pacific Canada. I don't think that's the case. So again, even though CRA doesn't look at these numbers, they're of particular concern to me. Okay, looking at some of the other stats. One of the things that they look at is called the pre-claim review and pre-claim consultation process. And there really are not many being done over the year, so we're talking roughly 200 a year being done. And I think that's an opportunity that's not being used as much of it as it could. So this is a process, and we'll talk a little bit about it as well in some of the success stories and new programs that they're coming up with. But one that I'm thinking has potential and maybe just needs a better strategy to pull it out. One of the other things that we see here is something called checkoffs. Checkoffs are basically largely in Atlantic Canada where where some of your payments for the various boards that you pay to go to research, and you automatically get the credits. So they tell you what or get the expenses qualified, and you can apply for the credit. So they'll tell you, your checkoffs are $20,000, and you can file a claim for eligible expenses of $20,000. This is just interesting to me to say, when we look at the total number of claims, we say, 19,000 or 20,000 claimants. Maybe a quarter of those could be just pure checkoffs, which means they're not actually doing the whole claims themselves. So it puts in perspective how many total claimants we really have and how those industries break down. Okay. One of the other things that's new to the CRA website, it was just released in March 2012, is called SR&ED Success Stories. So I took a look at this, and I won't spend much time on it, but effectively what the success stories are is a series of companies that talk about different experiences they've had with different CRA programs. So whether it's a pre-claim process review where they come in and talk to you, whether it's a first-time claimant service, or whether it's something specific where they come in and ask you questions. And then there's additional testimonials in here. So they talk about different industries, how they may have free seminars that an industry association can do. I've taken an example here of the ROCAN description. So if you click on any of these and get the details. But effectively what they are I would call it more of a testimonial that they tell you in one sentence or so how something worked effectively in the SR&ED or one of the programs was used effectively. So I think these are interesting to say the least. I'm not sure that they're that, other than that, they're more that they're currently that useful to claimants, that they're more of a testimonial than something where I can say, why can't we perhaps take an idea like this and add examples of eligible projects or something else of that nature that may again be useful to claimants. So go forward from that point. Okay. Something just happened to my meeting layout here. Okay, here we go again. Okay, at this point, I'll pause and hand it over to Julie, who's going to talk about the effects of COVID-19 and some of the related programs that have just popped up.
I don't see any chat again, so that's not an option for me. I don't see an option to put in questions or receive questions. Also, I don't know. Do I have control over the screen right now?
Yes, Julie. If you look at the bottom left corner, there's arrows that go up and down. You're on page 56 of 170.
Okay. There we go. All right, so some of these slides were not prepared by me, but I will talk about them nonetheless as we worked on this together. So in general, around the middle of March, CRA was inundated, of course, with millions of EI claims. Also, their entire workforce went work from home, largely, right? And so that put a stop on SR&ED applications for a little while, and there was a lot of concern as of March, end of March, what was going on. But CRA really stepped up to the plate, and I really have to give kudos over there to Jason Chiron in Ottawa for recognizing that you know, the department played an important role in getting Canada through this hard time. And so what they did was they started prioritizing claims and accepting claims as filed. And that's the type of thing that I'm going to be talking about today, what's actually going on. This slide I can't talk to. I'm not sure what that means. But what we do see is most SR&ED claims are being processed as filed right now. I'm going to be talking about that a little bit more in a second. But non-refundable claims may not be being processed right now. We've heard that CRA is processing or prioritizing refundable claims. And non-refundable claims, we don't know yet. Something I'd like to ask Jason there is if that's a permanent stop on non-refundable claims, or if it's going to be a few months before they get back to them. That I'm not sure of, and I'd like to ask Jason about that. I'll come back to these slides because I don't know anything about those things. I'll talk about this, and then we'll see if there's somebody else who can refer to those parts. Okay, so with regards to the program, you know, the program's been around for 30 years, and so what we've seen is the program oscillating between incentive mode and compliance mode. We saw it with some of the statistics that Dave also gave, we've all seen kind of a difference in behavior between the auditors. It seems like every few years there may be some new trends as far as new compliance that they're looking for, or maybe they're moving back into incentive mode. We can see that with the FTCAS, which came out a few years ago, which was definitely part of swinging back into the incentive mode, whereas before that, FTCAS didn't exist, and first-time claimants were being hammered and getting hit out of the program. So these are positive movements as well. This little slide I have there. But right now, I see a real change. It's not in between incentive or compliance, it's stimulus. And that's why most claims are being accepted as filed right now, because this is important for the economy. And of course, that's a good thing. But this is the real thing I wanted to talk about. This should not be considered an opportunity to take advantage of the government. I think really strongly about that. I'm not sure who all the audience is right now, but I think it's very important that the community doesn't take advantage of the program. Bogus claims should not be put in. I wanted to remind everybody here that CRA does have 12 months to go back and open up any claims that are clearly fraudulent, bogus, not in an eligible category. So that is something that I wanted to talk about. Actually, that was this slide. Sorry about that. So right now, CRA can't conduct in-person audits. So we don't know how long that's going to last. And I do not see CRA using video conferencing. Video conferences can easily be recorded, and we know the CRA does not like to be recorded. So I don't see video conferencing becoming a thing. Also, CRA has never really adopted these type of technologies while in the audit phase. Well, we know that they don't even use email address, email, right? They're still using faxes. So what I think we're going to see is a lot of the CRA reviewers moving to work from home. We see that already. Our own practice, we see CRA dealing with the portal. I think we're going to basically see a lot of desk reviews going forward. I don't know how long that's going to last. I think that's a question we have for Jason. But I definitely see for the next few months, we're looking at claims being accepted as filed and other audits being requested through desk audits. With regards to first-time claimants, that's also what's interesting, what's going to happen, right? I'm not even sure if CRA has released anything about this, but what I think is going to happen is CRA is probably going to phone call or call first-time claimants, and at that point we'll start to hear what CRA is saying, whether they are giving any advice, whether they are going to say, hey, we'll see you next year. I think it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, but we'll see about that when those first-time claimant calls come through. So this was the part that that I really wanted to focus on, is that I think we as a community have to know that yes, there is less of a chance of being audited this year, but remind everyone that CRA does have the up to 12 months to go back, even on refundable claims. Even if you do have a completely legitimate claim, you should keep your evidence for the next 12 months if you put in a claim. So those are some of the things I wanted to talk about. And the other ones, Dave, I'm going to have to revert back to you because I don't know, I don't really want to talk about IRAP or CE or the other programs because it's not my area of specialty.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Yeah, sorry, I'll talk about these other ones. So we were actually going to run a poll. However, we didn't get a time to get that out. But I did an informal poll to just talk to other practitioners and claimants, particularly refundable ones, about whether they'd seen assessments coming, and overall the trend is positive. So most of the feedback has been yes, we've been seeing assessments come, and there was a bit of a panic before when things shut down. IRAP, again, IRAP's actually kind of stepped to the plate here as well, in that they've got another program called the IAP program and it's a $250 million allocation that they made for any of the high-tech companies, so technology-based companies who didn't qualify for the standard wage subsidy for normal companies, for whatever reason. So you didn't qualify because there's some criteria, but you're high tech, you can instead basically get all the same benefits through this program, and it circumvents the requirements of the CEWS program. I've also, and I won't get into the wage subsidy program. One of our other presenters, Elizabeth, has on her website put a nice little summary of how it works, but it's basically up to $10,000 per employee at $850 a week. Okay. One of the other things that's coming up is the question, well, if I have a wage subsidy and let's say the person is doing research at that point, maybe they can work online or whatever, is it government assistance? And the answer is yes. So the work that they're doing that you're getting paid for by the government through these subsidies will in fact be government assistance if you're claiming that portion of the wages on the SR&ED return, and that's pretty much the effects. A high level overview of the main effects for COVID on the current SR&ED situation. Okay, one thing I'd say is that our last section on the tax cases is going to be probably fairly long. So why don't we do? I'll hand it over to Earl to do some questions on the COVID or field any, but if we don't run too long on that, maybe say 10 minutes or so or less, we can maybe jump into the tax cases. And as I said, I think that we may need all that time in order to finish by the deadline. So I'll hand it over to you, Earl, if there's any questions at this point, and then if not, I'll continue on the into the tax cases.
Oh, can you hear me? It's Russ.
Yeah, go ahead, Russ. Yep.
I just wanted to reinforce what you said. Certainly there's going to be reviews and attention given to what is filed and what's in the stream process by CRA. Government has basically said that. And any of us who've been around for years in the program, here's what goes into this incentive mode. And some individuals take advantage of that. That happens, it's really damaging. Not necessarily. That's my one comment I make. Thanks to you.
All right, thanks, Russ. Any other comments? Okay, I think in COVID things are relatively positive from an SR&ED standpoint, as positive as they can be, in that, like I say, a lot of the funds were released without detailed reviews, so no complaints there, as Julia said. Okay, I will now start to discuss some of the recent tax cases in the past year. There's been a series of them both on the technology side and a couple interesting financial ones. One of the most interesting is a case called Beton Mobile, where it was a concrete process development case. And the judge looked at 14 separate projects in relatively high degree of detail. They broke down almost 50-50. 6 of them were eligible, and 8 of them were deemed ineligible. And we're going to go through with Elizabeth and Jay today to talk about, from a scientific perspective, why did some of those win and why did they lose, and what lessons can we take from that? So I think that will be interesting. That's why I'd really like to take the time, if we can, to apply it there. So what I'll do is I'll very quickly go through the first 4 of the technology cases, and also the 2 financial cases, and then I'm going to hand the field over to Jay and Elizabeth, who are going to talk about the Beton case in considerable detail. If anyone's interested, the full an analysis of these cases is also done in our project format. So what we often like to do is take the technology-related cases and take the information in the case and copy and paste it into relevant sections. Otherwise, it tends to be overwhelming, I would find, on a very large case to understand what is the meaning of all these facts and issues that they throw at us. So what we've used to analyze these cases is a little template here where we want to see if the claimants identified objectives beyond standard practice. So what have they done to benchmark their sources? Okay, have they been specific about objectives? And then for the hypothesis or uncertainties, have they identified legitimate variables for experimentation within their models? Then we go through the experiment results conclusion cycle. We like to look at, how the results compare to the conclusions, results to objectives, and most importantly, do we have conclusions on the variables of experimentation? Okay, so we've basically taken the data of these cases and we've tried to say, of the information provided to us by the courts, how does it fit into those slots, and how does it illustrate how to either comply with those requirements or the dangers of missing those requirements. So the first of the cases is a case called Clever. The facts of the case were that the tax credits were not large, but it was expenditures of around $70,000. The only witness was the daughter of the developer, and she was unrepresented by counsel. And this was probably the downfall of this whole case. That we're told that the company Clever was a software application developer, and they had a system called a schedule optimizer. And what it would do is it would prompt you for various inputs, and then it would determine or recommend a series of steps in order to complete construction and mining projects. So it was kind of a business planning tool, but maybe also a technology planning tool at the same time. And it's not clear from the case exactly what it is. Okay, and that will be important. So when we look at the witnesses in this case, Ms. Mathiol represented her father, who was deceased. She didn't have any formal software training. She wasn't actually part of the company at the time of the SR&ED in question. And really importantly, she didn't call on any of the current or former employees. Okay? The CRA, on the other hand, had their research and technology advisor who had a PhD in engineering management, which would be, relatively similar field to what we're talking about here with the CSO development. We're told in paragraph 23 of the case that there's a Dr. Zhu of the appellant, of Clever, the company, who had met with the CRA and tried to explain some of the constraints of the organizer at an earlier, we'll assume, a site meeting. So it was interesting that Dr. Zhu was never called on in the court case to be a witness or anything, and I think this could have been some of the problem. Okay. So basically there was two activities. The first activity was a requirement to the API because Oracle had changed some of its database interface without publishing all the right instructions on how to update the API. So the client had to do experiment to learn how to integrate with third-party software. As a rule of thumb, we've seen from other cases, that's generally not going to be seen as a technological advancement. So that activity was ultimately deemed ineligible. The interesting activity was on lateness. So the second activity was on what they call a lateness and overhead calculation factor. And they looked at 5 different courses of conduct, we're told. And the client argued that these are their hypotheses, that they use that lateness cost interest calculation, compound lateness calculation, so that's for lateness, and then they were trying to minimize fragmentation. So they use some different methods here, standardize, and then they use critical path analysis or bottleneck resource analysis using different points of view. Okay? So these are basically the fundamentals of the algorithms that they're using. And we're told in there that they look at 5 potential solutions, testing multiple databases that They look at a composite resource-only data set, discrete resource data sets, and mixed resource data sets. So we're not told what they analyze or conclude about it, which would have been interesting. We're also saying that they looked at different sizes of data sets, and they segmented them into large, medium, and small. And concluded, so they made a conclusion or technically an advancement at the end of the day, that the incorporation of lateness and standard overhead costs were effective to simulate a human decision. Okay. So the problem here is, one, the interface activities are typically not eligible, so that was deemed as routine engineering. And with respect to the lateness activity, not that it wasn't ineligible, but the information provided, supporting information, didn't establish the scientific uncertainties in modeling the problem, using existing meta-heuristics, solving the problem, and devising or adding new heuristics. And that would have been the types of evidence. So the judge didn't say this couldn't be eligible. It could have been eligible, but the evidence to support why it would have been was not. Okay. So if we look at what I call the key criteria summary, a quick overview of this, we didn't do a lot of benchmarking of existing practices or knowledge. We don't have quantifiable specific objectives. The technological uncertainties are basically applying meta-heuristics and understanding third-party APIs, which are, probably ineligible to do the APIs. And the meta-heuristics is an interesting field in itself. So the judge's comments, and ours too, is there's really no explanation why the proper witnesses weren't called, the people with the technological backgrounds who would have been able to explain those situations. The API work, as we said, is typically not eligible. But one of the other issues that I see here, and this is part of the problem, is that work on social sciences, accounting, management, finance, etc., are not eligible, is not an eligible field of advancement versus the natural or engineering sciences. So it's unclear here when I see overhead allocations and cost calculations. I'm not sure whether the software is trying to make advancement in the field of software engineering, or whether the software is perhaps trying to make an advancement in some other field, such as mining or something of that nature, in the predictive process in there. And these would be the kinds of fundamental things to say, what field of science are we really making advancement in? Is it a software advancements, or is it an advancement in civil engineering or mechanical engineering, or et cetera and so forth, based on the industries that we're specializing in and the flow that we're making? So again, we didn't really get enough information here to figure that out, but these would be the concerns that I'm looking at. I'd also say that meta-heuristics could be eligible if and only if it's properly documented. And back in 2017, we did a discussion of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and meta-heuristics is a big part of that. So if anyone's interested in that, you can go through our website, project examples, and either download or watch the video for that particular topic. Okay. The next case here was a case called Cam Press Metals, which was a custom structure, and in this case, the client lost. There were 3 witnesses: the general manager, the sales and engineering manager, and the SR&ED consultant himself. And what we're told is that they wanted to design a memorial niche, so for a funeral parlor, and it had different sections and aesthetic effects. Okay, so aesthetics is one of the things where right away my alarm bells start to go off. They considered 3 designs, we're told: metal, glass, tempered glass, and acrylic. They cited 6 specific issues in developing the acrylic design. And one of the problems they said was they couldn't figure out how to assemble the niche columns out of acrylic, but they subcontracted back to an acrylic manufacturing company, and that was supposedly relatively easily determined. So this is one of the ones where, the judges often like you to have expert witnesses to explain in their opinion, why there was an advancement in that field of science. In this case, the judge said that he did not require the use of an expert witness to determine that this was not SR&ED, that was clearly some trial and error, work on CAD exercises, and a step-by-step progression that just varying of components and procedures is not necessarily SR&ED because it wasn't really couched in any hypothesis or any specific technological uncertainty. So in this case, the appeal was dismissed with cost, which is relatively unusual, and really illustrating that the judge was unhappy with the situation. If we look at the key criteria summary, again, there was no benchmarking done of existing methods. There were very few quantifiable objectives. So aesthetic things are not the same as quantifiable precise measurements. I'd say that the uncertainties or the variables that they've cited were more marketing versus technology issues, and thus the weakness of that claim on numerous fronts. Okay. Okay. Now, turning on to a positive note, going into the win column, the case of Crl Engineering. So Crl Engineering is an appellant that developed software technology to predict transit movement. So, when's the train going to be there? What time is my bus going to come? These are the guys who developed the algorithms for real-time vehicle arrival and prediction model. And uses a combination of their own algorithms and GPS data to predict accurately when public transit buses are going to be on schedule or what the effects of the delays are going to be. Okay. Looking at the witnesses in this case, sorry, I should say the CEO and COO, but they were both PhDs in this case, and both had backgrounds in electrical engineering. In this case, the CEO who testified was also a professor of electrical systems at the University of Regina. So very credible. As different than the other cases that we looked at, we have people who are testifying who, one, were familiar with the work as it was being done, and secondly, have the requisite technical backgrounds in those fields of science. So the argument that they made was that the idea of prediction algorithms using GPS was nothing new. However, the uncertainty was in using general purpose computing systems to do all of this. So they say, well, maybe with supercomputers or whatever, this would be doable, but we're trying to use lesser computers with less processing power or whatever to make this happen, and therefore research would have to be done. Now, I would say at this point, wherever you're looking at stuff like that, I would try to always benchmark what can be done easily on a mainframe or a large computer, and what do we mean by general purpose? Like, what's the difference between general purpose and non-general purpose, and how does that create the variables of uncertainty? So again, that wasn't done in this case, but ideally, these would be the kinds of thought processes that you want to go through to understand why do claims qualify, why do they not, and how can we make sure that we've put the most relevant information forward. Okay. Now, the CRA's position is interesting here. That as I said, they've said, well, use of GPS and predictive algorithms for transit is nothing new. It's been around for a long time, and just saying we want to make it better, can we do it, is an overarching hypothesis, is the word that they used. That we have a series of unrelated and unconnected tasks with no real hypothesis. And I would tend to agree that can we do something? Yes or no, binary question, is usually not a great way to phrase a scientific or technological problem unless it really is not doable. The question is, can we do it with this level of accuracy, with this level of processing power, at this CPU load, at various other things, would be the relevant factors to determine whether we can make this work or not. I'll assume that this was probably done, but again, it was not described in this particular case, which is again one of the weaknesses of these cases, and why I'm of the personal opinion that being able to to view these cases live, just like many public cases are done on television, would be a great idea. Okay, so we're told here that the experimentation is the client actually went and put these series of computing units inside a series of transit vehicles and then collected data on them. We're told they did various iterations of code, but we're not really told exactly, what were the iterations, what were the uncertainties, and what were the more complex options that they talk about. So again, these are the kinds of cases that shelter the reader in the reports from what might have actually happened, why operations were seen as complex versus not complex for someone with that skill set. So like I say, this is a positive indicator on this type of work being eligible. However, sorry, who's ever playing with their mouse there, can they just stop moving that slide? Thank you. So they talk about how to do the work. So the experimentation was documented by a series of weekly system snapshots, and that was really the types of information that they came in to court with, and which the judge deemed as acceptable. The system snapshots of the changes, I will assume, with some analysis of what the changes were and conclusions, would have been the core of the SR&ED and would have represented the technological advancement. So we'll have to infer that there was offering something good, but we weren't really told what it was. What we are told is that the results were reported in a scholarly journal, and that was provided, and claimed to be a launching pad for new achievements in distributed computing. And again, as a result, the judge felt that this did represent an advancement and was SR&ED, so positive. However, as I said, the real scientific issues that we would ideally like to see were not really disclosed in this case. And very often where claimants come in with very high level of degrees, PhDs, and specialists in their area, they're given a little bit more of a benefit of the doubt than people who don't have that. And that would be consistent in this case. Okay. So looking at Crl Engineering, again, we're not really told what benchmarking, what due diligence work the client did. That's a huge weakness, in my opinion, one that actually could have brought the claim down, but nonetheless, they were able to, through their articles or whatever, provide enough evidence that the judge was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. Some of the objectives that they talk about are accuracy of data, so ideally that would be quantified versus current performance methods, creating an autonomous system, using general purpose equipment, and distributing the data, all of which create, particularly in distributed data, can create a series of problems and bottlenecks. We'll assume that the key variables that they had to deal with were the characteristics of the physically distributed equipment and the methods to use the autonomous systems. Okay? But again, had the cases provided us some more information about the actual science, what was really going on, rather than a high-level summary, this case would be much more useful. Okay, so our comments is I agree with the CRA's opinion that the can we do something is generally not a great way to approach it, particularly when this task was done before. I mean, there were GPSs to use to predict movement of vehicles. There's no doubt about that. So to say that you'd be the first is pushing it. Again, unless you can be very specific about how you're outperforming other methods, again, it lacks the detail, I would say, to be a useful case for us to glean stuff in the future. Okay. Next case. This is one that I find interesting, Exxon, because in the definition of SR&ED, it specifically says that it excludes the drilling for oil and gas, the actual drilling for it, although it clarifies that developing new methods to drill for oil and gas might be eligible, or to drill for any minerals or substances. So the facts of this case is that Exxon drilled drilled a well that was roughly 4,600 meters deep, and then they had some problems here, and the tip broke off of the drill and torqued off, and they lost it. But it came back to the question of, you know, whether the money they spent was SR&ED or not. And the position that they took was interesting, and the judge noted it, and I noted it as well. And the basis is that they wanted to use the results of the well drilling to validate prediction models with a new methodology that they had by a consulting company that they're using to predict, you know, where oil is. The evidence and witnesses were both PhD doctors, so they were both highly represented. So the judge commented that the evidence that was provided interesting technical background. However, it wasn't really useful in determining whether there was any SRED conducted. Okay? The CRA's position was that the drilling was done to delineate the oil field in Hibernia, and that it was exclusively a commercial project. It wasn't really, the primary intention was not research. Okay? So they look at the definitions of SR&ED and the fact, as I mentioned in 248 sub 1, that it excludes drilling for petroleum and natural gas. Now the key point here that the judge noted, and this is always going to be an issue in these kinds of things, that when you have a model, it's arguable that any well that you drill could be used to evaluate that model. So in effect, if I'm working on a model, any drilling that I do, all of the drilling that I do, could conceivably be argued as SR&ED. And the question is, was the primary intention of drilling this well SR&ED, or was it really just to determine whether or not there were minerals in that particular place, not to develop new methods? Okay. So one of the problems that the client had here is that they have a presentation to management that the CRA got a hold of. And in this presentation, it talks about the primary objectives of this project were to drill target layers, to determine the economic viability of the platform. That's the primary purpose in the company's report, not to determine or evaluate issues, or something like that. But to determine what was in the platform. Sorry, someone's just playing with my mouse here. I'm going to have to stop for a second. Can one of the presenters who's ever touching their mouse please stop touching it for a second so I can control my slides? Thanks, guys. Okay. So some of the issues were the depth, the reservoir quality, and the economic viability in that report. All of which the judge is saying these are not scientific issues. These are pure economic issues to establish whether the oil is present. Okay, and they're saying that that is a clearly commercial job, which can be distinguished between an SR&ED job where you develop a new plant or product to test a new improved process or technology. The latter contributes to technological advancement, whereas the first is merely searching for oil and doesn't create any technological advancement. So again, this looks like a pretty clear-cut case where I look at the criteria that there's no real technology benchmarked, the objectives are not technical at all, they're all commercial, and there really is no technological uncertainty. So the loss seemed relatively obvious at that point. Okay. So what I'm saying is this case is interesting. It shows a failure of SR&ED in exploring for minerals, but it also clarifies that there could be potential areas of SR&ED. And what I would say is that if the client collects this data, which is probably commercial, but at some point goes and starts to analyze the results of multiple sites like this in relation to the model, once the first site is drilled, the subsequent analysis of that data to see how it relates to the site, but not the cost to drill the site itself, but the subsequent analysis may be eligible SR&ED if it ties into the model as we're told. Okay. Last thing I'd like to do is make a little analogy here to differentiate this concept from one that making a prototype part and maybe testing on a commercial site. So if we develop, say, a prototype device and took it out to a commercial site to be tested, my view is that the labor, in order to do that testing, would be eligible whether or not it's on a commercial site. And I base that position on previous tax court cases like Cultures La Flemme and Consultex that set a precedence to say that you never really get your labor back on that kind of thing. If it's focused on a valid resolution of a scientific and technological uncertainty, whether it's done on a commercial site or not would be less relevant. It would be the scientific intent of what we're doing. And the failure here was not the fact that it was done on a commercial site or might have commercial value, but more the fact that it really had only commercial value. It did not have any clear hypothesis or technological advancements entailed. Okay, that's great speed on that. At that point, I think we're looking pretty good to move up to the next section. Sorry, I'll talk about the financial cases, and then we'll hand it over to Jay and Elizabeth to talk about the Beton case. All right, so the first of the financial cases is a case called CO2 Solutions, and it deals with the CCPC status. So effectively what happened was this company was incorporated in 1997 and claimed and did work in the field of carbon dioxide capture and management. It claimed refundable tax credits until it became public in 2004. Then it lost its entitlement. In 2005, it got an idea. Let's restructure our corporate structure in order to get CCPC status. So they incorporated a private corporation here, but the problem was that they were financed by a public corporation and its subsidiaries. Okay. Now the arguments of the claimant here is that despite the fact that it had the same board of directors, it appeared in the company's financial statements, and actually the voting control of the company was held by the parent company or the public company. It argued that in operational terms, it was independent, it had its own bank account, financial statements, etc., and that there was almost like a gentleman's agreement that though the board of directors were the same, that they would be almost a hands-off and let the individual run the company. Now the real problem here is that, number of things, but even the evidence itself on the certificate of incorporation said that only the public company or its subsidiaries could hold the shares. So this was a case of clear voting de jure control. The fact that the claimant argued that even though you have voting control and you can make me do what you want, you've decided not to, and to allow me to operate with autonomy means that there was no control. And that's just clearly not the case. 256 5.1 says if you could control it, you're deemed to control it. Whether you actually exercise that authority or not is completely irrelevant. And so, the results of this case were pretty much set at the outset here. Okay. The second case is one, an interesting tax planning one, and it's the use of the SR&ED pool losses in ITC. So what happened is we had a company that, had basically not been profitable, and it had loss in ITC carry forwards. They call that tax attributes. And through a series of transactions, it spun its assets and liabilities to a new corp, but kept its, so basically all that was left in this shell company was losses. And then it basically raised money to put into that company in order to generate profitable business to use up the losses. In the industry, they call that a recapitalization or restart transaction. And the fact of this is that it was, that's an okay transaction to do. And really what happens is when there's an acquisition of control of a loss company, so when a company has losses and there's not a change in control, but an acquisition, a clear acquirer of controller that didn't have control before, then there's a deemed year-end, and certain things take place, but most importantly, you're going to face the fact that you can only use the losses against the same or similar business going forward. Since here there was no loss or change of control that we're told about, or acquisition of control, that's not the case, and you're allowed to take your loss company and roll profitable business into it in order to use up those losses. So that was just an example of good tax planning here, in my opinion. Okay, that more or less wraps up the lower end cases, and now I'll pass it over to Jay and then Elizabeth to talk specifically about the case of Beton Mobile that I referred to before. Thanks, guys.
Excellent. Can you hear me?
I can hear it. Yes, yes, we can.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, David. I guess you know, first of all, thank you for putting on this webinar. My name is Jay McLean. I'm happy to be involved to represent M&P and just generally represent all SRED stakeholders. And so this one, this case is interesting because it's a lot around technical eligibility, and some projects were deemed eligible for SRED and some not deemed eligible for SRED. And so this dates back quite a ways, back to 2010 to 2012. There are 3 different fiscal years submitted. The judge ruled on this case in December 2019, so not all that long ago. Overall, I'll try to give a brief overview, and then we can kind of dive into a couple examples of the projects and then talk about maybe some of the takeaways, which is probably most important. The details around this company is that they were a mobile concrete company and submitted 14 projects that ended up in this court case. The company was represented by itself, the president and founder, Jacques, and then as well as another engineer that worked at the company. And the CRA had 2 different RTAs involved. So kind of the facts that's outlined in the court case document, paragraph 30, if anybody has that or wants to kind of reference it, was that the taxpayer testified that they did in fact have the dates and times and a brief description of when the tests were conducted in a notebook. And while they weren't, say, crystal clear for perhaps maybe another engineer to review it, the taxpayer could in fact understand it themselves and work in conjunction with their computer files to kind of reconstruct what was put together, or what was documented and what happened in the project. So I think reading between the lines, I'm thinking that there's probably an opportunity to improve the kind of documentation and of all the tests conducted and whatnot there. So overall, there are a lot of different variables. Again, this has to do with concrete, and the typical kind of components of concrete are cement, sand, stone, and water, as well as some adjuvants or additives. You know, you'll come across issues around how much entrained air you have in the concrete, the super plasticizers or different additives and latex that are added for kind of achieving different properties. And in the court document, you can see that the taxpayer had 300 different concrete mixes, and they said they develop about 15 to 20 new ones per year, and that's a combination of all these different factors. You know, there's 6 or 7 different cements they can use, you know, different types of stone or sand, and you know, hundreds of different additives that could be utilized. So that's kind of the facts or the items they were varying. And so I guess naturally it comes down to kind of the question about kind of benchmarking the prior art, or what is kind of standard practice in the industry. And you can see that the taxpayer worked with the MTQ as well as the universities. And as a starting point, they did bibliographic research as well as discussions with colleagues and industry and university professors, and kind of determined that the existing documentation and the public domain, the studies and knowledge base, do not really address the issues that this taxpayer was looking at. And you know, they were really working with mobile concrete mixers. So your typical concrete, you know, is mixed kind of in a controlled environment in a factory, gets put in a truck that you see driving down the road that spins and keeps the concrete consistent. This was a different type of mixing, mobile concrete that's mixed on site. So that was a new variation, as well as the existing public domain documents didn't really touch on the winter factor or durability factors that they can experience in Quebec. So all of these items kind of form kind of the hypothesis around kind of the desired mixture. And I think you know, the concern really for this project in general or this case in general is around you know, the evidence of an advancement and evidence of a systematic investigation. And you know, obviously all of these projects are going to relate to Income Tax Act 37 and Section 248(1). So if we jump into like the specific projects, you can see there was 6 that I kind of highlighted here. These are all ones that went in the taxpayer's favor, meaning the SRED was awarded to the taxpayer. And I thought we could dive into to talk about a couple and then maybe look at the judge's comments and maybe have a discussion or any questions on these. So this specific project, you can see, was 1104. This means it was the 4th SRED project submitted in the 2011 year. Was for a quick setting, self-compacting concrete. I feel like I'm a concrete expert after reading this case, which I'm not, as I have a smile on my face. But nonetheless, the facts of the case, as outlined in paragraph 261, is that this was really intended to be a concrete repair. So a customer came to this taxpayer and said, "Can you repair the floodgates, the slideways for the floodgates of a hydroelectric dam?" And the critical aspect is that, you know, the valves could not move while the concrete was poured and cured, and so that resulted in the need for a very quick drying concrete without any deformation. And the objective set, you can see at the bottom of that slide there, really were comparing what the taxpayer had, what type of mix in concrete that they currently had, and currently they were able to achieve 10 megapascals, which is the compressive strength of the concrete, and they could do that in about 48 hours. They can get concrete to cure to that level. But in this application, they wanted the customer wanted it to cure within 24 hours. Likewise, they also wanted it to cure within 7 days to be 50 megapascals in strength. So the current technology, the current mix that they had would cure to 50 megapascals in 28 days. So you can see a very significant improvement upon, or at least very striving for a significant improvement in their cure times. So with that in mind, the court document outlines that the projects were initially denied in paragraph 269 on the basis that the activities could not be classified as SRED, and it is well known that the addition of accelerator admixtures are used to obtain better resistances more quickly. And hardening more quickly. In addition, the RTA and CRA comments, I think, around that there was no systematic research carried out within the framework of this project, and the method base was trial and error and using available knowledge. So that was the original reason why this project was denied. And the experimentation high-level summary is outlined in the excuse me, the court case document. And initially, the taxpayer did some visual tests, tried to evaluate the setting time of kind of the standard concrete mix that they use. They increased the accelerator, which did in fact lead to a faster setting of the concrete. However, it did not achieve those strength properties that they were looking for. So then the taxpayer worked with a cement manufacturer, and they had many different iterations of different formulation changes on the cement that forms part of the concrete mix. And then next they tested different cement and mixed it with a general purpose cement in order to try to improve that strength test that they were trying to achieve. And then finally they opted to use a binary cement, which they comment they had not used in 10 years, and they ended up replacing the typical superplasticizer with another additive, which typically was known to be less effective, and they eventually were able to increase and achieve that 24-hour target. So very high level kind of summary of the experimentation that took place. So what did the judge say? So the judge said that Mr. Bertrand made a comment that, yes, we were aware that binders or additives have been the subject of publicly available studies. However, what is not documented is the combination of all these components within the context of self-compacting concrete and with the mobile concrete mixture that introduces a different mixing energy. Hence, there's the presence of a technological uncertainty when you combine all of these elements. And the ruling that the judge made is the judge made, I do not believe the taxpayer is simply qualifying products. And as practitioners, we hear that a lot. You're just evaluating or current off-the-shelf products or technology, or mixing kind of different technologies together or whatnot. The judge went on to say, on the contrary, the taxpayer did create a quick setting self-compacting concrete that did not exist before. So there was kind of some advancement there, and the taxpayer, it was acknowledged by the judge that the taxpayer could not trust any of the current studies. And so likewise in 274, there was numerous tests that were quoted that were done by independent laboratories, and there were lab reports, and then the verbal testimony as well. So that the conclusion of the judge was, yes, in fact, this project does constitute SR&ED. So this slide really just kind of summarizes all the different key criteria, around kind of the objectives and the different, uncertain mix aspects and costs and whatnot. And this kind of comes to now our commentary section. And really, I think this seems to revolve around defining a TU and how to do so, and what is a reasonable search, or how do you define a TU? What sources do you use, or search terms, and is the prior experience of that taxpayer relevant in defining a TU? And so we thought for a second maybe we should just explore what prior art samples exist. And so this is just something that we've done. We've gone and just done a quick kind of Google patent search to see if this would be useful. And you can see at the top there that we entered in the same kind of project type description that they're working with around the influences of binders and additives in performance of self-placing concrete. And so this was one of the patents or articles that came up, and you can see we pulled a bit of a snippet from there. Overall, I mean, this study doesn't line up 100%, or this patent doesn't line up 100%, but it does look at, concrete in cold climates. It also looked at asphalt with cold climates. But it did not kind of make any commentary around, mobile mixing or achieving, 10 megapascal strength within 24 hours and whatnot. I mean, it was somewhat relevant, but not a perfect match. So likewise, then next we typed in quick setting self-compacting concrete here for the Google patent search, and a few more items, patents and applications have popped up here. And this one did talk about the freeze, thaw, the heaving risk that can take place in cold climates. But again, it didn't line up 100%. But this was a fairly quick and easy search. I'm trying to think of a way to define or establish a TU, and I don't think there's any absolute rule on what is a reasonable search. Obviously, the more searches we have, the better. Maybe these documents can provide similar objectives, and maybe they're using different methods or different ideas or synergies. So anyway, that was kind of interesting to look at it through that lens. I think another couple interesting comments the judge made is they dismissed that the trial and error argument, and that comes up again on the next case, so I'll hold a few comments for that. Also, interesting comment the judge made about the taxpayer working with a third party, in this case the cement manufacturer, and the exact quote was, "The scientific method does not prevent teamwork." And that really stood out for me when I read this. And the judge went on to say, and that the direct planning of a trial influences the activities carried out by that taxpayer. And so I think there's probably practitioners and stakeholders that have been in this situation where there's third parties involved. And anyway, that was an interesting outcome and comment made by the judge. And then lastly, on this project, I think the last comment was just really around having detailed records. I mean, there was some labor hours that were removed, and I think just having more detailed records, even around kind of that defining that TU, would even strengthen this project, even though it was accepted by the judge as SRED. I think there's opportunities to improve a bit there. So I'm going to run through, just highlight this case, because it also kind of, again, it's dealing with concrete, and there's a few similar items that come up and a few different items, and then maybe we can pause and I can pass it over to Elizabeth and or we can have some questions. So switching gears now, this is kind of a separate project that was submitted in the SRED claim. This was a 2012 year, the first project, and it was around using latex and developing a fast-setting concrete. And you can see that, again, this started by a customer that came to the taxpayer. A customer was Transport Canada, and essentially wanted to know if they could develop concrete to repair the taxiways at the Montreal airport. Essentially, they wanted to do this using a quick-setting concrete that would get the aircraft taxiways operational as soon as possible. Obviously, they can't be down for weeks on end while the concrete cures. So this revolved around removing the latex component that was added into the typical mixture. That would kind of they're obviously trying to develop that rapid achievement, get that strength to a certain level, and have certain durability and flex capabilities within the concrete. I feel like a concrete expert here. I said that. It's pretty funny. Okay, so let's jump right through to why the project was denied. So the project was originally denied because it was deemed that this was a commercial project and not a SRED activity. Also, comments were made, as per the court document, that the majority of the steps taken and discussion with the taxpayer experts and partners show that information was accessible, I'm assuming accessible in the public domain, and that this approach is an ordinary method, and tests are trial and error based on kind of available knowledge at the time. So the difficulties encountered are also normal. That was another statement that was made, and can be resolved by current practices in the field. So that was the reason the project was denied. Again, very high level kind of experimentation, what was done. They did have, previous failed attempts, but then they ended up finding that this super plasticizer additive could improve concrete without the use of latex and improve the concrete setting and compression strength. So this kind of led to formulations of two mixtures. Both were tested in a lab and to evaluate their compression resistance at a young age, meaning just several hours after mixing. And that kind of led the taxpayer to study different possible adjuvants or additives that come in liquid form for the mobile concrete mixture, and they made a note that in the case that typically those additives are solid input, powder input, as opposed to liquid, and that, I guess, formed a significant factor in this case as well. And then finally, some of the tests that they did, yes, they did achieve some faster setting concretes, but they were not able to achieve the chipping resistance or the air bubble, consistency and network, and so those were kind of, didn't really come up to the bar that they were looking for as far as their properties. So what did the judge say in ruling on this? You can see that under 320, around the technological uncertainty, they could not predict if the objectives could be met using the current technical studies. Yes, the objective was to develop a new product for sure and evaluate, something without latex, but would still have kind of the same properties as latex. And they were trying to kind of understand the interactions of the different additives and compatibility in this quick setting kind of environment that they were looking for. And it was also interesting to note that the documentation, the public documentation, was almost non-existent. And that, I think, formed a was a factor in the outcome of this. Working down through kind of paragraph 321 and further on, you'll see that there's new knowledge gained in the performance of certain superplasticizing additives in this mixture, and they hypothesized these additives could yield the same properties as using latex. So for all of these reasons, the judge saw this as being, yes, an eligible SRED project. So what are our comments? And I'm going to just pull out a few comments that jumped out again from me from the judge here. And obviously the comment around the tax authority, saying that this was an emergency repair and it was a commercial project. And I think the issue around this is really, does the commercial value or the fact that this is within the context of a commercial project, does that remove the SRED eligibility? And my opinion is likely not. Maybe in some cases, depending on the work performed, but in this case, the judge decided that it did not. And just another reference, Dave mentioned, some cases prior to around the cultures, Laflamme and Consultex, also touch on this kind of commercial environment, if anyone is interested. But basically, the takeaway from this is that yes, SRED can exist within the development of a product and or service, and that science should determine the eligibility. It seemed to me that the court overall likes to see projects that start, SRED projects that start with due diligence searches and existing prior attempts and kind of helping to define the technological uncertainty. I think, the judge actually went on to say in 327 that hours spent doing bibliographic research serve to support the development of the mixture by the taxpayer and support SRED activities. So interesting how the judge saw that the due diligence time in spending and doing the research was actually eligible for SRED. Often as practitioners, I think, we see otherwise. And another item that jumped out was the verbal testimony, again, was accepted and was deemed kind of a critical factor in establishing that this was a TU. And finally, my comment on trial and error. Again, it was argued that this was a trial and error project and not SRED eligible. And the judge's determination here, in exact words, there were that the tests were carried out and modifications to adjust the dosages were made in reaction to these results obtained, and therefore the scientific method was followed. So I think sometimes we struggle with commentary around this as trial and error, but in this case the judge decided that was not applicable and that the project was in fact deemed, yes, eligible for SRED. So I'll pause there. I'm not sure, Dave, if you wanted to do any questions, or Elizabeth, if you wanted to jump right in and talk about some of the specific projects in the same case where they were basically ruled ineligible. I'll pass the controls over.
You'll pass the baton over to me. I will accept it.
All
Dave,
right.
do you have any feedback before we go into my half?
I'll let you go ahead, Elizabeth, because I'll do the. I think we'll have time. I'll do the what if at the end, so I can actually just include all my stuff when I talk about that.
Sounds good. So this is the continuation of the great presentation that was just done by Jay. While there's lots that can be gleaned from the winning cases, we often learn quite a lot from losses as well. And that's what I'll be going through in this half of the presentation. So we'll be looking at the 8 unsuccessful projects and focusing specifically on 2 that were, in my opinion, particularly interesting. So just a little bit of background. As always, when we get to this stage and we're actually looking at the cases themselves, there's a lot of limitations in terms of what information we have available to us. We don't know what was submitted in the original T661. We don't know really what was in the correspondence, and we don't necessarily have access to the actual testimony that took place. So getting to this point, it's a narrowed view of what happened, so it has to be viewed with a very different lens. But I also want to really emphasize before we start just how long it takes. So if you're considering going down this road, be cognizant that it can take quite a while for this to be resolved. In this case, it was 9 years before some of the projects reached this resolution. And it's always good to know who's involved. So the judge had been involved on 2 SR&ED cases recently, and so far it's not a great track record for whoever's going up with this judge. But I'll talk about why that's good to know and why looking at this case is really helpful. So again, in terms of the people that were on the stand, the CRA put forward 2 very well-credentialed individuals that were discussing their perspectives, not only as professionals in their field, but also as SR&ED consultants. BMQ put forward 2 witnesses from the company, again, very experienced individuals that had decades of background in this space. So this is one of those cases where you have 2 very, very intelligent groups discussing very granular points. And what came out of it is quite interesting. So the framework for this case, which Jay alluded to, and I'm going to go into it just a little bit more here before I talk about the losses, is how the judge laid out the ruling. So this judge, she was heavily reliant on Northwest Hydraulics, as most are, including listing out the 5 questions that we're all familiar with. What I thought was really interesting is she pulled a lot of her references from IC 864R3. And for those who are newer to the program, this is what was in use up until about 2014. And because these projects occurred prior to 2014, that's why I would assume that she chose to use this particular policy information circular from that time. What we're looking at now is the SR&ED eligibility work policies, which in theory are the same, but as we know, there are some subtle differences, so just keep that in mind. What she did really well here as well, and this is useful for anyone who is in a difficult position of pushing this through a little bit further, she really carefully outlines the key concepts, including what is considered scientific or technological uncertainty, how a hypothesis is defined, and Jay talked a little bit about this, and Dave did as well, that overarching overly broad hypotheses are not something she will be accepting, that she really did focus on the scientific method and then what is considered enough documentation, so formal reports and in some cases verbal testimony. However, there are limitations to that, and I will talk a little bit about that. So just quickly, I'm not going to go into quite as much detail about the concrete, as exciting as that topic is. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the policy points, but this was the first one that we talked about. So the study of permeability to chloride ions and durability with various pozzolanic additions and cement. So quite a mouthful, but the essential background is here. So in 2009-2010, the ministry added new requirement standards to concrete, namely a permeability threshold. So currently, or at that time, in order to meet concrete standards, there were 22 tests, and this was a new test that needed to be added, and all of them had to be passed in order for the concrete to be used. So a grace period of a few months was granted to the companies to give them time to do the tests that were necessary to demonstrate that their concrete mixes complied with the new standard. It happens all the time that these sorts of things come out, everyone's left scrambling, and that was the case with this organization. So Dave did a really nice job of putting up this little summary again that lays out the types of activities that would have been done. But as you can see here, we don't have a lot of information actually coming out of the ruling itself, likely because the judge didn't feel it necessary to really emphasize this because it was not successful. But what the judge did do is summarize the experimentation as she understood it. So in this case, BMQ made an inventory of its products, checked which ones met the standard, changed the mixing sequence, added adjuvants as required, and they selected the mixtures which complied with the standards. What's really important to note here is that BMQ didn't investigate the reasons why some of these mixtures did not meet the standards. So they went through, they figured out which ones did, that they could either use as is or modify slightly, but there was no further analysis as to why something worked or did not work. So the taxpayer position in this case was that data was missing and that it was collected by running these tests within the framework of the project, and it allowed them to reformulate some of its mixtures to improve them in regards to this particular requirement, so the permeability of chlorine ions. CRA obviously didn't agree, which is why we ended up in this position, and what their position was that existing mixtures containing known ingredients were tested. The techniques used to adapt the mixtures were also considered standard engineering techniques. The argument they made was the scientific method was not respected since no links between the mixtures were tested. So there was no logical sequence. They simply abandoned some when standards were not met, and instead of, again, trying to understand the causes of the failure. So the judge was very deliberate in her assessment here and put down what she observed through all of the information presented to her, which was that the notes, she noted that mixtures tested directly were not reformulated in any way. They also carried out the test to verify the effect of pozzolan on cements, but these are actually well known and well documented in scientific literature. And the mixing methods are fairly well known. Again, the taxpayer did try to argue that the use of a mobile concrete mixer introduces a degree of unpredictability, but as she states later on, that just wasn't enough to really indicate there was a technological uncertainty. So again, mobile concrete mixing didn't bring enough to the table in terms of introducing an uncertainty. She also put forward an interesting argument that she didn't believe that the ministry would introduce a new standard if they thought that companies couldn't meet it. In essence, she indicated that they hadn't convinced her that they'd followed the scientific method. So even though tests took place and they reviewed the results, the organization skipped from one mixture to another without an analysis of the reasons why the mixtures met the standards or not. And as a result, she was led to the conclusion that it can't be SR&ED because normal product characterization tests, so does it not meet the standards, have not actually created any scientific uncertainty. So these are the concrete lessons that I'd like to think comes out of this. So keeping good documentation that shows the thought process, including the analysis of why it worked or didn't work, is important in this context. So you want to have a really good foundation to build upon. when she goes through the analysis as well, she took a look right down to the level of the timesheets. And while we all know that an allocation method is possible, that's carefully outlined in the Salary and Wages Policy under Section 13.1, it's important to proof your timesheets because it will come up if you get to this level to see if some of the work being done is considered normal data collection. And it's really important as well, and we talked about this earlier on, and Jay covered this, that you have a really good foundation, that you're firm on what your technological uncertainty is by doing that due diligence at the beginning. So that was the first one that was interesting. And the second one was very much viewed with the same lens. So the second project was the improvement of quick-setting concrete. Someone has moved my screen and I can't see the slides and I don't know how to fix it. Thank you. And in this one, they were, again, looking at making repairs to a dam. However, the inputs contained in the mixture segregated. So something was going on, and the test results remained satisfactory in their laboratory and didn't match the problems that they were seeing on site by the client. So there was something definitely going on, and they didn't know what it was. Again, Dave helped provide this summary here in terms of what was done and what we can glean from the ruling itself. And it's very, very broad. So there are hints of uncertainties and key variables. There was definitely testing that was going on, but it's very light on what we would like to see in terms of benchmarks, objectives, uncertainties, and the tests themselves. That said, the judge did outline the experimentation, and her understanding of it was that after analyzing the various factors that could cause a mixture to segregate, such as the weather or the presence of vibrations, the only variable that the organization could find that was causing the separation was the local water. So in theory, any potable water should work, and it shouldn't have an impact on concrete unless organic matter is present. So they repeated the tests on site. They confirmed that the water was the problem, even though it was potable. They did not, however, specify what element in the water could have had this effect. So what they did, the taxpayer did, was they changed their process. So water was therefore delivered to the site to allow the work to be completed. And from now on, water to be used in this mixture at any site that they were working on in the future would be sent back to them so they can run some tests to see if it will work or not work. And if it won't work, then they will send out water that they know will work on site. So the taxpayer position here was they were aiming to determine the factors that might affect a mixture on the job site, which met standards when it was tested in a laboratory. And the new knowledge that they were arguing that they generated was the impact of water on concrete. Now, the CRA's position is, once again, that this was not experimental development. It was more along the lines of trial and error. So the mixture that was used was already known. Although a handful of adjustments were made, the steps that were taken were aimed at solving a technical problem, which is the term no one wants to hear as someone applying for the SR&ED program, that it was solved by trial and error, since BMQ used public data and experience of its staff to solve it, and problems encountered in this, Dave, could you go back to whatever slide I was just on? The problems encountered in relation to that were, let me go back. Okay, were part of the current practice. So the judge's rationale for the ruling, the loss, was that the taxpayer used current technological knowledge. There would have been uncertainty if they had convinced the judge that the probability of achieving their objectives or way to achieve them would not be known or determined in advance based on the experience or technological knowledge that's usually available. And the addition of colloidal agent to decrease segregation of the mixture are common techniques in the industry. So a lot of this was, again, standard, which they were not happy about having it assessed as this during the ruling, but that is really how it came across. Now, one of the other things that came up, and Jay talked about this a little bit earlier, was the importance of the documentation, and that testimony earlier was used to accept some of the projects. In this case, it worked against them because the testimony wasn't consistent with the contents of the 2661 form and what BMQ claimed in the letter they sent in November. Again, we don't see that letter here, and the timesheets produced, that water wasn't really the focus of this project. And there was no mention of the tests that were carried out with the different water. So that inconsistency was jarring from the judge's perspective. Again, they felt that it was more of a trial and error method because they didn't apply the scientific method, even though several hypotheses were put forward. And finally, the tests could be partially reconstructed using the documentation, but it wasn't possible to follow the thought process, how BMQ got to each of the conclusions and how that influenced subsequent iterations and subsequent tests. So if we think about the experimental process, so the test analysis conclusions, that wasn't captured in here. So again, the concrete lessons that came out of this, and I cited the different sections of the ruling. So do keep good documentation that shows the thought process. Once again, looking at the why something worked or didn't work. That helps close the circle in terms of the experimental development process and the scientific method. Without that additional step of asking the why, individuals such as the judge have really not a lot of leeway to assess this as anything but trial and error, because the only new information that was generated was something worked or it didn't work. There was no analysis as to why. It's really important that you don't get mixed up and that the trial testimony should not contradict the 2661 statements. And again, while allocation methodologies are accepted per the policies, timesheets are the preferred method, particularly with mature organizations. But if you are using timesheets, make sure that they are accurate. So in this case, the judge called them out on having double entry and estimates for some of their time. Now, a point that Dave and I had discussed earlier was there seems to be a bit of a double standard when it comes to specified versus non-specified employees. So specified employees generally are more senior individuals within the organization, and getting a CEO to fill out a timesheet is like herding cats. So the CRA graciously allows many executives to estimate their time, and there's a little more flexibility with these individuals, but it's still good practice to make sure that you have a better understanding of exactly what your time was, because the judge did call them out on this. They indicated that there was the better part of 10% of the time that was estimated, and the judge adjusted some of those numbers accordingly. So those are, in my opinion, the concrete lessons that came out of the concrete case. I'm going to turn this over to Dave to wrap up and add in the what if. So what if they had done things differently? Could you have had a different resolution for the losses here? And if there are any questions, I'll leave that open as well. Dave?
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, that's great. Why don't I continue right on then? Because what I'll do is I'll take one of those cases that you did, and I'm going to do a little what if. So, while the idea of that Polizon case is still fresh in our minds, I'll recap that really the problem here is that the client in many ways didn't do much due diligence. They just kind of jumped in and told us, they have some objectives on compression resistance, spalling, freeze, air bubble distribution, but they didn't quantify that. Okay, and the courts say that systematic investigation involves extremely accurate measurements and analysis of those measurements. In the Northwest Hydraulics case, they actually go on to say, without such measurement analysis, systematic investigation cannot exist, from a previous case called SAS Manufacturing. So again, having objective quantifiable measurements is critical. Having yes, no, can we do it is interesting, but it's not what they're looking for. So if you can't provide extremely accurate measurements, you may not be doing systematic investigation. Now, what we're told here is the key variables of uncertainty involved around adding the pozzolan, the effects of latex, and modifying the mixing method. So I'm saying on the basis of that, we've got a couple different areas that could theoretically form a basis for technological uncertainty. Again, what I feel the client's weakness here is they really didn't do enough due diligence about what are the limits of any of those methodologies. So I took one, for instance, and did a due diligence search through Google Patents, like Jay showed earlier, and said, what if I search for pozzolan with mobile mixers? And sure enough, within a quick time, I found a patent that was filed in 2005, granted in 2008, using mobile mixers with suitable catalysts of pozzolan as accelerators. So I'm saying, well, this sounds a lot like what we're doing here. So and it's a patented thing, so maybe they actually talk about the science, which would be patentable. Let's see what this company did in relation to the same kinds of things that we're doing that would be patentable and perhaps illustrate technological advancement. So it was a company called Roman Cement, and we're talking about a brief summary of the invention that they wanted to replace a portion of their cement with pozzolan to increase yields of concrete with higher durability, low chloride permeability, reduce creep, increase resistance to chemical attack, and lower cost and environmental impact. So these are all quantifiable good things that could increase the concrete, which we'd want to measure. We'd like to provide that. And we're told that also limits the use, their use is limited since too much will retard the strength development, which is exactly the situation that was faced by Beton in their project. So we're told here that this invention relates to the pozzolan cement blends that are particle sized, optimized to replace it. So now this patent makes me think, or indicates, without being an expert in cement, that particle size could be a critical part of this process. Okay? So we said, well, pozzolan is a variable, and now I'm saying within that, maybe there's sub-variables such as particle size. So what we do is we look at the patent itself, and I look at the claims, and these are just for ideas, and it talks about having a distribution of differently sized pozzolan particles with different diameters, nanometers, and microns of size, right? And that certain particles are too large and certain particles are too small. So they talk about that. So I'm saying this in itself illustrates a variable of uncertainty and patentable variable of uncertainty. Had the client started to look at the pozzolan and the relation with silicates and sulfurs that were clearly illustrated here, maybe this would be a basis of technological uncertainty. They also go on to say not only is the size of it, but the method of manufacturing the cement, how to stream it, how to stream the cement itself with the pozzolan particles, how to grind them, how to blend them, all of which appear to have technological uncertainty. And I'm saying some of these actually may have been faced by Beton and lead to technological conclusions, but we're not told about any of this. So what we're trying to do here is illustrate that this case lost because it really didn't focus on the science to the degree that it could have. There's the landmark case of Northwest Hydraulics says that, quote, incremental improvements were added to the act just to clarify that most scientific or technological advancement are infinitesimally small incremental improvements to existing technologies. Okay? So we don't have to be 50% or even 10% better than we were before. We could be trying to be a tenth of 1% better than we were before, as long as it involves technological uncertainty. And the technological uncertainty is the underlying factor that must be met there. Okay? So again, they say that the advance doesn't have to be spectacular, and often things that look routine in hindsight were very problematic or required experimentation. So the point that we want to make here is that ultimately, the difference between an eligible and an ineligible project, the Beton project versus the one that we looked here with the cement, could be the basis of due diligence work that will allow you to identify the hypothesis, will allow you to be very specific about what variables are known and unknown within the predictive matrix or models that we have. And in my view, had the client done that kind of work, they may have been eligible to claim that project. Okay, I'll wrap it up on that one. And maybe at this point, Earl, I've got Angela with us if we want to continue right on the hot topping, on the court procedures, or if we want to briefly, I don't mind taking a little break if we've got questions or people with anything they want to do there. Okay, so if there's no immediate questions, I'm going to pass it over to Angela, and she's going to talk about two new court processes and procedures that could be relevant to SRED claimants.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about Practice Note 22, hot tubbing, and Practice Note 23, the preliminary docket ruling. The second one just started January 1st of this year, and the former came about in 2019. So the preliminary ruling docket hasn't had much effect yet, given the fact that we've had the pandemic, and there have been some issues, obviously, with closure of the courts. So I'm going to start out with Practice Note 22, Experts Panel on Hot Tubbing. So hot tubbing is a term that really originated in the United States about getting all of the experts together in one spot in order to have the court determine the viability of the experts, as well as whether or not it would be useful to have everybody come together, submit their expert reports, and see what can be done in terms of streamlining a trial, especially in complicated matters where there are a number of experts. So this one started, this was released by the Chief Justice Rossiter on March the 11th, 2019. So here's the protocol now for the Tax Court of Canada for hot tubbing, getting all of these experts together. So I'm going to go through this slowly because I find that there's a lot of intricacies here, and I'll explain as I go. So the first bullet is the judge shall do a lot of reviewing, defining, and determining. Has to review the pleadings, statement, notice of appeal, as well as notice of defense. Define the issues in the pleadings. Determine if the experts are required or to be presented. Determine if the reports have been exchanged in accordance with the Tax Court of Canada rules. Are there any issues with respect to the qualifications of the experts? And if there are issues with respect to the qualifications of the experts, what in fact are those questions? And then there has to be a determination if there's going to be an exclusion from the hot tubbing process, whereby this is a case that isn't suitable for doing this. The second bullet point is the judge shall determine if the experts are qualified. Are they qualified to opine on the issues at hand? And if they are, can it be dealt with on a consent basis, having these experts come forward? Or does there have to be a voir dire on a specific issue? And a voir dire is really a trial, a mini trial within a trial. So if the qualifications are acceptable to the tax court judge, the judge has to do another determination as to whether there is any dispute on the report or challenge to it. So these are the questions that have to be asked. What are the challenges and disputes? Do they go to the weight of the evidence? Do they go to the credibility of the report? And do the questions go to a substantive issue that really is one of the matters that has to be addressed by the court at trial? So the next step is for the judge to read all of the expert reports with the consent of the parties. Sometimes you'll have one party have more than one expert report. Sometimes each side will have an expert report. Now, with respect to the fifth bullet point, before the hot tubbing panel is set, the judge has to order that the experts meet pre-trial to see if the issues can be narrowed, and they want to address issues of disagreement and see if there's commonalities that can be made. The lawyers and parties have to attend the meeting. With respect to the sixth bullet point, The judge has to set the panel only after all factual evidence has been put on the record by the parties. So for instance, if there are outstanding discovery issues whereby one party has to provide certain documentation to another party, there's no way that the hot tubbing will proceed. With respect to the seventh bullet point, the judge shall first prepare the questions for the panel and then present the questions to each panel member. So really it is almost as if they're setting up a panel. And then each expert is going to be asked the same question. And each expert's going to be given the time to provide a comprehensive explanation and expansion on answers so that the judge can comprehend and compare the answers of each of the experts. Now with respect to bullet point 8, after the judge is done answering all of his or her questions, each counsel then has an opportunity to examine that expert and conduct a cross-examination. But there are limits on the cross-examination. And the limits are on clarifications of the evidence that had been provided and answered when questions were answered by the experts imposed by the judge, answering expansion of those answers, and if there are new matters that were raised within the questioning of the judge to the experts, then there's an opportunity for counsel for the parties to ask questions on that. So that really is hot tubbing in a nutshell. I would say that it's certainly not new to Ontario. It's been under the rules of civil procedure, but it is new to the Tax Court of Canada, and it's been something that I've attended CPD programs probably for the last over 2.5 years now, where they've been talking about doing this practice direction that finally came about in March of 2019. So moving on to the more hefty practice note, the most recent one, practice note number 23, the preliminary ruling docket procedure. This is the one that came about by Chief Justice Rossiter December 12th of 2019. So really what this is a pilot project that's occurring in Toronto and Vancouver, and it's meant to occur for 1 year, so the year of 2020, to see what the outcome is, to test it, and to determine whether or not this is something that really should be instituted, whether it be in the Tax Court of Canada rules or whether it remain a practice note, because it is so difficult to get legislative and regulatory change with respect to regulations. Even though they're a lot easier to amend, it's very difficult to get consensus, obviously, in Parliament. So that's why the Chief Justice issued a practice note on this, because it really was felt with the costs today of litigation at the Tax Court of Canada, not so much the informal proceedings, but obviously the general proceedings, that there needed to be some sort of a streamlining done to allow for an easier way for parties to deal with litigation. So I see that I think we start paragraph 4. I'm going to just go through the first few bullet points before we get to 4. So there's 17 principles, terms, and procedures that need to be addressed in this preliminary ruling docket procedure. The first is that it has to be by way of a joint application of the parties, and it has to be within 120 days of the close of pleadings. So in other words, that's after there has been the service filing of a notice of appeal and defense, and if there is a reply response. With respect to the second point, in terms of the contents of the joint application, the parties have to indicate why such a hearing would be useful, the estimated trial time if it were to proceed to trial, the estimated time it would take for a preliminary hearing if one was granted, what amount of tax it has issued, but not the interest, by taxation year or reporting period, whether there are any Tax Court of Canada related appeals, how many witnesses would be called at the preliminary hearing. If a party wishes to call an expert witness at the preliminary hearing, there would need to be established exceptional circumstances in order for the court to grant leave, and a list of documents by each side that would be tendered at the preliminary hearing, and an explanation as to the relevance of those documents to the issues at trial. In terms of the third point, the Tax Court of Canada would review that joint application and it would make a decision, preliminary ruling or otherwise regular stream. In terms of the restrictions on matters that can be dealt with by way of a preliminary hearing, they really are dealt with under the point 4. So these are matters that are only subject to preliminary hearing. The trial of the appeal is expected to last more than 2 days. The preliminary ruling is expected to last the trial of the appeal is expected to last more than 2 days, sorry. The preliminary ruling hearing is expected to last no more than 2 days. So 2 days is the magic number. Both parties are represented by counsel. It has to be a general procedure, so no informals. The appeal only involves questions of fact or mixed questions of fact and law, so there can be no questions of law at issue. In the case of appeal under the Income Tax Act, either A, the aggregate amount of all amounts in issue is greater than $25,000 and less than or equal to $300,000 per tax year, or B, the amount of the loss that is determined under subsection 152(1.1) of the Income Tax Act, and that is an issue is greater than $50,000 and less than or equal to $600,000 per tax year. And the final point is that in the case of appeal under Part 9 of the Excise Tax Act, the amount in dispute is greater than $50,000 and less than or equal to $300,000 per reporting period. So these are just random numbers that the Tax Court of Canada has plucked and determined that these are going to be cutoffs for the preliminary ruling docket. With respect to point 5, if there's a primary appeal and a related appeal, the tax court will permit them to be heard on common evidence together if the conditions in paragraph 4 are met, if the appellants are the same or related, the issues are related, counsel is the same in both, the related appeal deals only with questions of fact or mixed fact and law, again, no questions of law, and the hearing will last no more than 2 days. In the preliminary ruling stream, there's no examination for discovery on affidavits and no compelled discovery of documents. If you want to rely on any documentary evidence, then you have to make sure that it's served on the other side within 30 days of the preliminary hearing. Only expert evidence will only be allowed with leave of the court on exceptional circumstances. 15 days prior to the preliminary hearing, pre-hearings briefs have to be served and filed, and there are requirements for length and content. Now, surprisingly, with respect to point 10, the tax court will not be bound by legal or technical rules of evidence at the hearing. So it's not that they're going to throw caution out the window and throw rules out the window, but they will be much relaxed, very much akin to small claims court trials here in Ontario, and I'm sure the way that small claims court trials are run across all the other provinces and territories. Just going to move this down. Sorry about that. Oh, no. Okay. In terms of length, it can, again, the magic number is be no more than 2 days. Now, the judge here in the preliminary hearing has to issue his or her ruling within 60 days of the completion of the hearing, and it can be oral or written. And within 30 days of the issued ruling, there are certain things that the parties have to do. The parties shall either file a consent to judgment, agreeing that they're willing to settle on the terms that were provided for in the judgment without costs, or they jointly advise the court that there is no agreement with respect to the preliminary ruling results, they don't accept it, and they're going to prepare a timetable jointly so that the rest of the steps in the matter can be dealt with. If there's one party that does not accept the ruling, then the preliminary ruling judge shall not preside at the hearing of the appeal when it goes forward to trial, shall not participate in the appeal in any manner in the future, or communicate with any judge involved with the appeal concerning anything that was said or done in the preliminary ruling hearing. So as can be seen, it's very much like a settlement type of hearing where whatever happens within the preliminary hearing stays at the preliminary hearing. B, subject to section 16 and 17, the party shall not disclose anything that occurred at the preliminary ruling hearing to any judge involved with the appeal, in other words, going forward at trial. And subject to section 16 and 17 below, The following shall be sealed and shall not be available to anyone other than parties without an order of the court. So in other words, this is all of the documents and the preliminary ruling itself. So all documents relating to the hearing, transcript of the hearing, if the ruling was issued in writing, the actual ruling, and if it was issued orally, the transcript of the oral ruling. With respect to point 15, if both parties don't accept the preliminary ruling, there shall be no costs awarded. With respect to point 16, if one party does not accept the preliminary ruling and another party does, for the purposes of Section 147 of the TCC Rules of General Procedure, the preliminary ruling shall be deemed to have been a written settlement offer served on the non-accepting party by the accepting party 30 days after the preliminary ruling was issued, either in writing or orally. And the restrictions in subsections 14b and c above shall not apply for the purpose of assessing costs. And then with respect to paragraph point 17, notwithstanding subsections 14b and c above, and subject to the Canada Evidence Act, the evidence that's given by a witness at a preliminary hearing may be used for the purpose of impeaching the testimony of the witness in the same manner as any previous inconsistent statement by that witness. And witness, of course, in this case would also include an expert witness and, of course, lay witnesses. So unfortunately, this has not had much traction because it just commenced January 1st. And with the closure of the courts about, I would say, mid-March, it only was in effect for about 2.5 months. So we'll have to see what happens as courts resume and there are more matters that are able to avail themselves of the new rulings. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it back, I think, to David.
Thank you, Angela. It's great. I'm going to just see if I think Earl might have had a problem with his microphone. I'll see if he can go again. Hi, Earl. Are you there? Oh, there's a... Okay, well, nonetheless. Anyways, if there's any questions, people can field them. I realize we're coming close to our 4 o'clock ending time. So you can use the chat or raise your hand with any questions or comments. And we'll give maybe about 5 or 10 minutes to close it off, and then we'll officially end the session. Okay, so I'll leave the field open to comments now or questions. Oh, hey, Earl. Okay, good. All right then. So I think Earl might have a bit of an audio issue. No big deal. It looks like we're at the end here. So I'd just like to thank all the participants, contributors, and presenters, as well as people at CRA who helped us with our presentation. I think it's going really well. And in a nutshell, I think things are actually starting to stabilize from the problems that we had back 3 or 4 years ago that we illustrated with the statistics. And I'm guardedly optimistic that things are getting back on track. So once again, thanks to everybody for coming out, and hopefully we'll see some positive, a continued trend of positive developments.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Earl.